Good afternoon or morning, depending on your hemisphere. Welcome to the series, Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles, coming to you virtually from Oxford, UK, New York City, and Washington, DC. I'm James Foster, Vice Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs here at the George Washington University. Today, I'm representing GW's Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, and I'm joined by Sabina Alkire, Director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, who along with the Human Development Report Office of UNDP bring you today's event entitled Social Protection and Multidimensional Poverty, Lessons from Ethiopia, India, and Peru, presented by Liyousew Borga of the University of Luxembourg, and his co-author is here as well, Conchita D'Ambrosio. Good to see you, Conchita. With discussion by Catherine Porter of the University of Oxford. Great to see you as well. Well, in a moment, we'll turn the podium over to Sabina to introduce our speakers and to provide her perspectives on today's topic. But first, I'd like to express my appreciation to IIEP's Executive Circle for their support of IIEP events and research and student scholarships. On Wednesday, the 10th, IIEP's Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series will feature a conversation about the Wales Transition Lab entitled Accelerating Systemic Transformation, a case study from Wales, UK. For all those interested in China and India, IIEP's Envisioning India series will present Talking on China, the Imperative and Agenda for India, on Wednesday, the 17th of November. All of these can be seen live online or in reruns on the YouTube channel. The next episode of the Multidimensional Poverty series brings in Nicola Suppa for a presentation entitled On Track or Not, Projecting the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index. To learn more about these and other events, go to the website iiep.gwu.edu. And if you miss an event, check out the YouTube channel IIEP GW. Now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Sabina for today's introductions. Sabina.
Thank you so much, James. Well, we have a treat in front of us with different presenters and with a really interesting paper. So I'm delighted to introduce Liyousew Borga, a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Luxembourg, who before that was a junior researcher at the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education Economics Institute in Prague, and he did his PhD there. His research interest is in applied econometrics, mainly labor and development econometrics, but he's particularly interested in the early origins and evolution of health and human capital, and also in the role of intra-household resource allocation, and as today's paper shows, the measurement of poverty and vulnerability. So what he wants to understand is the mechanisms through which effective policy interventions and optimal choices of investment can mitigate inequalities and poverty to promote human development. His co-author in this paper is Conchita D'Ambrosio, who is a professor of economics at the University of Luxembourg, and she's also previously was at the University of Milan Bicocca. She studied economics in that same university in Milan and also at New York University, where she obtained her PhD. She's well known to many in this circle as being the longtime editor of the Review of Income and Wealth, indeed since 2008. And she's had many visiting fellowships in universities around the world and participated in many task force, such as the Eurostat task force to develop the EU Silk ad hoc model on well-being. And she's also been a research associate with OPHI from 2009 to 2011. So it's a delight to hear both of their papers, or their joint paper, and to hear and have both of the co-authors in this call. And discussing their paper is Catherine Porter, who is the new and incoming director of Young Lives, for which warmest congratulations, Kath, and also a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics in Lancaster University. And her research interests have often been in applied microeconomic microeconomics using panel and longitudinal data set, and particularly looking at the impact of unexpected events or shocks on different outcomes like nutrition or education or parental investments, and how inequality throughout childhood into adolescence and into early adulthood develops, and how policies can be effective in remedying such social inequalities. So it's a wonderful lineup of people, and we look forward to your engagement. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Now let me start sharing my screen. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for giving us this opportunity to present our paper for such a diverse and interesting audience. This paper is a part of the joint project by the French Development Agency, AFD, and the European Union in their research facility in inequalities. And we'd like to express our gratitude for their support throughout the development of this paper. This is the roadmap of the paper, the presentation today, and it's pretty standard. I will start by motivating the paper and trying to highlight our contribution. I will briefly introduce the study context and the mechanisms through which we expect impact, which I will follow by explaining the data and empirical strategy and presenting our results, and then I will conclude. Many countries, particularly in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, have adopted social protection schemes as a way to combat poverty and inequality. And according to the World Bank's 2018 State of Social Safety Nets report, globally, countries are spending about 1.5% of their GDP on average on social protection programs, which means about 44% of the total population is being covered by these programs. And the good news is, according to the same report, about 36% of people have escaped absolute poverty due to the transfers received from the social safety net programs. And interestingly, the report also claims that countries tend to be spending more on these programs over time. However, because of this important role of social protection programs as a tool in combating and reducing global poverty, a number of studies have tried to document the different effects of these programs. And the consensus is that generally these programs are successful in reducing the negative effects of economic and natural shocks. However, due to their large scale, these programs tend to be demanding both administratively and financially. And there is some evidence as well that these programs may have some unintended consequences. For example, an increase in child labor or some other adverse effects in human capital development. Despite the great interest in these programs, the literature is rather limited when it comes to evaluating the effect on multidimensional poverty. And the evidence we have so far is largely limited to effects and outcomes measured only in the short run. And it's these gaps in the literature that we're trying to contribute to in our paper. So we evaluate 3 large-scale social protection programs in 3 different continents: the Productive Safety Net Program in Ethiopia, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India, and the Juntos Conditional Cash Transfer in Peru. We mainly focus on multidimensional poverty indicators, as well as looking at a larger time frame where we observe the medium and long-run effects of these programs. All of these 3 programs involve a coordinated effort of all development stakeholders, including governments, donors, and individual households. So any evidence that we bring forward will be an important addition to future policy debates. I will now briefly introduce to you the 3 programs. The first program is the Ethiopian Safety Net Productive Program, which was launched by the government of Ethiopia and a consortium of donors in year 2005. And the main aim of the program was to offer households a chance to smooth their consumption without the need to sell their productive assets. And chronically food insecure households who could provide an able-bodied adult to participate in labor-intensive programs will be given transfers, and those households who do not have such adult labor to provide will get direct support. These programs involve mix of administrative and community input in selecting beneficiaries. And the ultimate goal is for households to be food secure and graduate out of the program. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which has been later renamed the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, is a public works program also launched in 2005 in India. And it entitles rural households in India up to 100 days of public works at the state level minimum wage. And it's a demand-driven program whereby adult household members apply for a job card, and they will either be given employment in public works programs, or they will be entitled to unemployment benefits. Even though it's a national program, mostly paid by the central government, implementation is done at local level, and it has been geographically and temporally staggered in its rollout, which is an important feature for us methodologically. The third program is the Juntos Conditional Cash Transfer Program, which is also again launched in 2005 in Peru. And as being a conditional cash transfer, the eligibility of households depend on the household composition, such that they have to include at least either a pregnant woman or a household with a child younger than 14 years old at the beginning of the program. And the conditionalities is that the pregnant women must attend antenatal care, and the children under 6 must be brought for health checkups at the nearest health center. And school-age children must attend at least 85% of the days in school. The program provides a cash transfer of 100 or less, which is roughly equivalent to about 10% to 15% of the average spending of the eligible households. Even though the general aim of all social protection programs is to reduce poverty, the way they achieve this goal crucially depends on the social protection design. And here we try to outline how we expect effects, or through which mechanisms we expect effects. And in terms of conditional cash transfers, which are direct payments to households on the condition that these households exhibit some behavioral change, we expect effects through 3 different channels. The first one is the direct income effect, which increases the household's minimum consumption floor. And we also expect effects through the substitution effect, whereby the conditionalities attached to the transfer induce some behavioral change and make it rather costly to keep children from school or not invest in their health and nutrition. We can also expect some distributional effects, whereby these transfers induce some intra-household resource allocation. And these 3 different channels may induce effect that will eventually reduce poverty. Despite their apparent success, conditional cash transfers have also their limitations. The conditions could be too costly or disruptive of optimal household behavior. And sometimes these programs exclude vulnerable households, such as the elderly, which could not qualify the eligibility criteria, but otherwise needy. Public works programs, on the other hand, have a twofold objective. They try to smooth consumption of recipient households by giving them transfer income, at the same time by using the labor provided by these participants in building public assets. Oftentimes, these programs are self-targeting and also counter-cyclical, so that households are able to invest more into their productive assets in lean periods without having to divert to selling their assets in order to smooth their consumption. In addition, these programs have either implicit or explicit training component embedded in the programs, which will increase the future employability of program participants. The data we consult nicely ties all these three countries for us. It's the Young Lives project, which is a study that tracks the lives of children in 4 middle and low income countries: Ethiopia, India, Peru, and Vietnam. It started, well, the first wave was collected in year 2002, and it continued for the 15 years after that. And the 5th wave was collected in year 2016. 3,000 children from each country in 2 different cohorts are observed. And even though it's not meant for policy evaluation, interestingly, it includes a rich set of information that's useful for our study. That includes well-being indicators such as asset holdings, consumption and wealth, health and nutrition status of household members, and other child development indicators. And in addition, participation status of household members in different social protection programs in each country is also recorded, including the duration and benefits acquired from these programs. So here is how we try to exploit this data for our research methodology. As I mentioned, there are 5 waves. One in 2002, the first one, and the last one in year 2016. And all 3 programs were announced in year 2005. However, due to different administrative reasons, actual program implementation started often after year 2006. For example, the PSNP transfers were delayed in the first year. The NREGA came into force in year 2006 as well. And a large number of observations in the Juntos case started benefiting from the program later after 2006 as well. So this gives us the opportunity to use the first 2 waves of the data, year 2002 and 2006, as our pre-program periods, and the 3 subsequent waves from 2009 to 2016 as our post-program periods. In order to empirically analyze multidimensional poverty, we follow the counting approach of multidimensional poverty measurement, which is basically counts the different types of deprivations that individuals experience in order to identify who is poor and then construct a multidimensional poverty index. In order to identify this, in terms of the indicators, we again follow the global multidimensional poverty index, which is outlined by the multiple reports of the United Nations Development Program Human Development Indicators reports. And this include 10 different indicators which are grouped into 3 dimensions. In the health dimension, we consider nutrition and child mortality. In the education dimension, we consider school attendance for school age members and years of schooling for adults. And in the living conditions dimension, we consider access, cooking fuel, sanitation facilities, drinking water, access to electricity, housing facilities, as well as ownership of different assets. And we use the cutoff as recommended by the UNDP multiple reports as well. So we basically consider 3 different cutoff levels, and we identify households as poor if their deprivation score is at least 33% of the weighted indicators, and we consider them vulnerable to multidimensional poverty if the deprivation score is about 20% to 33% of the weighted indicators. And we consider them in severe multidimensional poverty if the deprivation score is greater than or equal to 50%. We also report the incidence and intensity of poverty, such that we report the percentage of people who are in multidimensional poverty and the percentage of deprivations that are suffered by those individuals on average. So here is a summary of our descriptive evidence, and we present here 3 different poverty cutoff levels, which are separated by the 3 different colors. And for 2 different groups, program participants and program non-participants, which are separated by the line pattern. So the solid lines represent program participants and the dashed lines represent program non-participants. There are 3 main takeaways from the graph for Ethiopia, for example. The first is that we noticed multidimensional poverty has been declining from year 2006 to 2016 for both participant and non-participant households. Second, we also noticed that this reduction in multidimensional poverty is robust to the different poverty cutoffs. And third, we also observed that the multidimensional poverty index shows that the poverty levels of program participants, particularly at baseline, is higher than those of program non-participants, which is an indirect indicator of the fact that relatively poorer households have been on average targeted successfully by these programs. So we find similar pattern in India as well as Peru, and the reduction in multidimensional poverty in Peru has been sharper than the other 2 countries, even though it follows again a similar pattern. And we also observed that the bulk of the reduction in poverty happened between the years 2006 and 2009, which is the first few years of the 3 programs. We also present the 2 components of the multidimensional poverty index, which are the incidence and intensity of multidimensional poverty. And once again, we observe similar decline in both indicators. So the evidence I presented so far is encouraging in that we observe that poverty was declining. And however, this means that we cannot claim any causality for 2 reasons. One, poverty was declining for both groups, and which means there has been a declining pattern in poverty irrespective of these programs. And second, we also know from the description of the programs that participation in these social protection programs was not completely random. So in order to causally measure the effect of these programs, we turn to a difference in differences approach, where we basically compare the average outcome of program participants, the change in average outcome of the program participants, and the change in average outcome of program non-participants, with the identification assumption being that the general pattern of the outcomes would evolve in both treated and control groups had it not been for the social protection programs. So for this, our first challenge is to find a credible comparison group to those who participated in the social protection programs. And fortunately, this job has been relatively made easy for us due to the selection criteria of the programs. In both SNP and Juntos cases, selection was done based on observable characteristics, which means in Ethiopia, treatment was largely based on asset and income, whether the households have some land ownership, the income from non-agricultural sources, or availability of remittances, etc. In Juntos, eligibility was on the basis of a proxy means formula based on census data, which thanks to the rich data provided by the Young Life Survey, we can somehow emulate. So we use propensity score matching based on these observable characteristics to identify a group of households which have the same probability of being treated given these observable characteristics. In India, we were fortunate enough to exploit the geographical and temporal variation, which was a result of the staged rollout of the program among different districts. And in all cases, we were happy that the trends were not systematically evolving in the pre-program periods, and we were also happy that we have a complete common support to credibly use the propensity score matching results. So we estimate this regression model where we are trying to see the average effect, as well as the short, medium, and longer run effects of the programs. So rounds 3, 4, and 5 are the post-program periods, as I explained in the data description. And we also control for different household demographic and economic characteristics, as well as some community level indicators. The outcome variable is, we consider 2 outcome variables. One is the incidence of multidimensional poverty, which is a binary indicator where individuals that experiences deprivation based on different cutoffs is assigned 1 and 0 otherwise. For evaluating the intensity of poverty, we turn to the weighted deprivations of the weighted deprivation that these individuals suffer. Here is a summary of our result. As you can see, we consider 2 outcomes and 2 different poverty cutoff levels. 3 main takeaways again from these results. The first one is in the PSNP case, multidimensional poverty has been reduced only for those who are in severe multidimensional poverty, when we considered the cutoff level of 33%, we didn't find any effect, but we find a significant and lasting effect for those with a cutoff level of 50% and more. In terms of intensity, we do find that intensity of poverty for those who suffer multidimensional poverty has been declining in both cutoff levels. We find, again, similar result for juntos participants. However, in India, we also observe that poverty has been reduced successfully for both cutoff levels. And the third and important observation that we see from these results in all three countries is that the effect is sustained even in the 10 years after the program, as you can see in the fourth row of the tables. In India, Peru, as well as Ethiopia, effects have been still observed 10 years after the programs have been launched, which means that the positive effect that we observe from these programs is sustained even in the somehow longer run. Here we present the program effects for all for all multidimensional indicators. And we observe that the reduction in poverty is not uniform across all indicators. The first thing we observe is that in all three programs, deprivation in the asset ownership indicator has declined in all three countries, which is encouraging and a likely indicator that the direct income effect is at play here. We also observe that in all three countries, the sanitation facilities have also improved. Deprivation in this indicator declined. And we also observe that school attendance, also deprivation in this indicator declined in all three countries, but the magnitude is highest for juntos participants, which again implies that probably the conditionality that school-age children must attend at least 85% of the times in school has some positive effect in school attendance as well. However, we also see some positive outcomes from the public works programs of NREGA and PSNP, which might be due to the fact that the income effect is stronger than the substitution effect, which might have resulted as a result of a change in intra-household labor allocation. We have run several robustness checks in the paper. And the first one is we try to see whether these positive effects that we observe also extend to other well-being indicators than the multidimensional indicators I discussed so far. And we considered three different indicators. One, the wealth index of the household, which is provided by the data. And the second one is livestock holdings. And the third one is susceptibility to different shocks. And we observed that there has been a positive and sustained effect on livestock holdings, but not on wealth of the household. And we also run different tests to make sure that the results are not sensitive to different changes, such as placebo tests for different program implementation years. And we also played around a bit with the different deprivation and poverty cutoffs to see that our results are robust enough. So to summarize, we investigated the impact of 3 large-scale social protection programs in their effect on reducing multidimensional poverty using the Young Lives data, which was conveniently collected before the programs were implemented and after the programs were implemented simultaneously in all these 3 countries. And some descriptive evidence that shows that on average, poor households have been successfully targeted by the programs, and there has been a decline in multidimensional poverty programs, multidimensional poverty in all 3 countries. And our analysis also showed that there has been a positive impact on asset formation, livestock holding, and other living standard indicators such as improved sanitation, as well as an increase in school attending for school-age children. Again, encouragingly, in all these 3 countries, the program impacts have been sustained even in the medium and the longer run. And even though our analysis is not an experimental setup whereby we have one arm of conditional transfer and another non-conditional transfer in order to disentangle the source of the effect, there is some indication that the effects are mainly from the direct income effects of the transfers, which we can see from the effect on the asset formation as well as improved sanitation. But we also see that in Peru, the impact on school attendance is largest, which is an indication that the conditionality attached to the Juntos CCT is also has also some positive impact on school attendance. So I will conclude with this, and I will be happy to hear the discussion and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leo. That was wonderful, very clear, and very rapidly presented. So much information in such a short period of time. Thank you for that. Let me turn it over to Catherine Porter for her discussion. Catherine.
Thanks very much. I'll just share. I just have a couple of slides to highlight for the discussion. So thanks so much, Leo and Conchita, for this paper, which, yeah, I saw it in an earlier form at a conference in Addis Ababa before the pandemic, in the before times. And I'm very happy to see that you've managed to really get it finished really well and into a nice home in world development. So congratulations for that. And I've enjoyed your presentation. You covered a lot of information in a short time, so I just put some small summary on my slides so that people could hear the summary from me. That, yeah, you guys have done an amazing job with the data, very creative use of the fact that we have the same data questionnaires in the 4 different countries collecting very similar information, but also having some country specific information on the different programs. And I think Peru is very different from the Ethiopia and India program, as you've said, because it's a CCT. And Ethiopia and India, the programs are both workfare, food for work, cash for work approach, though they have this slightly different targeting approach, with the India government more on a rights-based approach and shouldn't have rationing. Whereas in Ethiopia, I think there's more involvement by officials at different levels of government in order to decide who can be eligible for the program, which is a slight difference. I think, yeah, you've documented very nicely in all cases an improvement in the multidimensional poverty indicators relative to non-participants. And what is new, I think, in the literature is how this has been sustained over quite a long time. The programs were introduced in 2005, and you're seeing some impacts in 2016 still in some indicators, which it's really quite impressive. One thing I wanted to ask about is how you've dealt with the fact that some people who were not in the program in 2006 may subsequently have joined the program. And actually, is your effects, are they a sort of lower bound of what we might be able to say, given that some people may have bounced in and out of the program in the control group along the way? So are the effects actually even more than what you've said? As Sabina said in the introduction, I'm the director of Young Lives, so I know this data set pretty well. It's a data set following two cohorts, the older cohort born in 1994 or 5, and we have 1,000 in each of the countries. And there were 2,000 children born in the year 2000. So this means that they were age 12 for the older cohort and age 5 when the programs were introduced. And so the Young Lives data set is not quite the same as, for example, the DHS or other data set where they do observe all of the children in the household. So what my summaries of your findings, again, I hope I've interpreted well, is that it does seem to be through the monetary route. The budget constraint has been relaxed in all cases, allowing households to make improvements in assets, and in particular, perhaps in housing quality and assets in the household. School attendance has improved. I read it differently in the paper, but in the presentation, I think you've emphasized more the Peru being more sustained. And I was going to ask you about how robust is the finding on in the other countries. Do you consider they did have any positive impact on school attendance in the Ethiopia and India? I think the results are, consistent with other work that Young Lives researchers have done, focusing on these specific children, particularly the ones who were 5 when the program was rolled out, which found that these children had improved their test scores in maths and in languages. So I think it's quite consistent with some of our results. And the fact that yours go into the longer term, I think is a useful avenue to think about future research on our cohort children and whether the impact of the program has continued into the longer term. So I found it a little bit surprising. I'm just reflecting really on this, that there were no significant impacts on the nutrition outcome, because I would consider that a bit the pathway into the cognitive effects that we found in Young Lives. And yeah, I was just wondering about that. I'm not sure whether it's the way the index is constructed, because we only have nutrition information for the index child, plus maybe one sibling, depending on that. So whether that sort of a bias is a little bit against that finding. And the other thing well, a caveat around the data, maybe around mortality, that the history of mortality in the household is slightly incomplete. And the one thing that I really worry a little bit about is, of course, if the Young Lives child themselves dies, then they would drop from the data set, so to speak, through attrition. So I would, I'm surprised that we don't find this nutritional effect, and I wonder if it's an artifact from the data. But that's something just I'm thinking about. So yeah, excited by the results and thinking now about what the next step is. Just to note, in case people didn't know, we were supposed to go for fieldwork in 2020, but the world changed, as we know. And what we've done is a series of phone surveys, telephone surveys. And so we do have some of the outcomes in the multidimensional poverty index, but I'm not sure completely all of them, but definitely around education. We asked questions around something called the household environment for protection, which was Caitlin Brown, Martin Ravalian, and Dominique Deval, I think, which is a little bit similar around assets, but focused more on how households could protect themselves from the pandemic, access to your own water supply, a spare room for your for somebody to isolate, whether you could work from home or in a more sort of socially distanced job. So I think in general, it may be interesting if people are using this kind of thing to see how that could be potentially adapted to the multidimensional poverty measurement if many people are using it. So to see about the follow-up, I think would be very, very interesting. And then, yeah, in 2023, we'll hopefully collect the full range of variables that we normally expect in young lives. And it will be, again, interesting to see perhaps at this point, whether there are any intergenerational impacts of social protection programs on the children of our young lives children. So just thinking about different research that we could do possibly together on these things in the future. So yeah, really nice paper, and I'm very happy to have read it and to discuss it. There's some information on Young Lives in case anybody would like to use the data as well. So thanks very much, and looking forward to the further discussion.
Catherine, thank you so much. Now, before I turn it back to the authors to respond to some of your points, let me just put a call out there to the audience to say there's a Q&A function here in wonderful Zoom. You know what to do with it. Put questions in the Q&A function. All right. All right. Now let me turn it back to the authors.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the wonderful comments and for thoroughly reading our paper. You are actually absolutely right in all the 4 points that you raised, and I'm just going to say yes, just to concur with you. So in terms of measuring probably the lower bound of the impacts is, yes, you are absolutely spot on, because there is some fluctuation in terms of program participation, particularly in PSNP, where in subsequent waves there are some people who join in and a few graduating, even though the number of people who graduated is actually quite small. So yes, we didn't directly try to deal with that, but again, we were encouraged, as you said, that we will at least be measuring the lower bound of the program effects. School attendance in Ethiopia and India, yes, it's actually sustained. In India, we see effects even in year 2016. In Ethiopia, we see effects in 2009 and 2013, but not significant in 2016. In Peru, it has always been significant and very large magnitudes as well. You're also right about the nutrition outcome. We have anthropometric information, as you said, for the index child and for one sibling, and even though not complete, for the mothers. So the information is not sufficient enough probably to detect effect. And we were very careful not to say that we didn't find any, or the programs are not effective in terms of nutrition, because actually there are some papers using the same data and finding impact on improved nutrition in Peru as well as Ethiopia. And we are also in terms of the mortality indicator, there are only few cases where we see this information. And as you said, in subsequent waves, when a young life's child dies, the household actually drops out. So due to that, we didn't report the results in terms of mortality in the main paper. Thank you very much, and happy to respond to questions if there are any.
Conchita, did you want to add something in there?
No, I think I just want to advertise Young Lives because it's a wonderful data set, very user-friendly, very easy to get. So please, if you're interested, just use it because it's really, really cool, and it has a lot of information that you may want. And we're definitely going to have a look at this. If it's already available, I'm not sure, this phone interviews to try to see the effect of COVID. Really, thank you for telling that to us. Thanks.
And thank you, Conchita, also, because I know that we have a few graduate students who are listening and who are in the middle of their dissertation or at the beginning portion. So just to remind graduate students, this is the time to find great data. Let me go back to the Q&A and start with Liyousew Borga, who says, this paper doesn't talk about the effect of SP programs on health, which is a distribution effect from behavior change. Is it because income increase or the smoothing are not commensurate to the costs of better nutrition? I'm not exactly sure what was being asked there, but if someone can make sense, please do.
I think this is, it's a suggestion for future research because there is a lot of information on health that we haven't used. So I think the same exercise could be done looking at health outcomes specifically of household members and the effect that the programs had on that. So I think it's for the future. I don't have an answer. We haven't done it. It should be done. It's a very good idea.
Great. So let's go to our second question, which is Samuel Whitman. I wanted to know if there was any attempt to try to see if this impact remained across social groups in participant countries. For example, in Ethiopia, were participants selected across ethnic groups, and was there any data collected as to whether this impacted the results? And I fear we're not going to have positive response, but I'll turn it over to the authors.
I'll take this one. Yes, that's a very interesting question. We didn't consider it for this paper because it will make it rather untractable to consider the different dimensions, and on top of that, having some detailed heterogeneity analysis. But in a different project, which is underway, we try to see if these social protection programs have reduced horizontal inequalities, which basically tries to see the impact of the programs based on different social constructs, based on ethnicity, region, gender, as well as I think place of residence. And we see some regional variation, and in India we see some positive effect for the lower caste ethnic groups, and but not much by ethnicity in Ethiopia. And in Peru we also find some positive impact for the I think the Mesitso, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, ethnic group. But that's an ongoing project, and we're hopeful that we'll give definitive answer in a future paper.
Yeah, N is definitely your enemy in many cases when you go into ethnic group discussions or other subsets, but it's always an aim of our work. One question I'm going to jump in and just ask you is this. I noticed in your results, or at least what I interpret them, hopefully I did it right. In the initial discussion, you showed that the intensity was really falling dramatically, whereas the headcount ratio or the incidence was pretty much slowly moving down. I may be wrong, and Sabina can correct me, but isn't that sort of opposite to what we often see in the measure? We usually see a radical change in number, but not such a radical change in intensity. And if had you explored that, that was my main question. But before I do that, I'm going to filter it through Sabina if she's available to filter whether my premise is correct. Sabina, are you there? Unmute.
Okay. Yes, the intensity does different things in different countries. So there's not, but often it has a less visible reduction than headcount ratio, in part because it is bounded at the lower end by the poverty cutoff. And so the range of values is smaller. And also because ceteris paribus, if you get the least poor people out of poverty, intensity would increase. And so often it is lower. But in some countries, and in particularly in the poorest countries, a lot of the work is done by reductions in intensity because most of the poor have a very large deprivation profile, and it has to come down a lot until they leave poverty. And so the pattern actually varies, with the poorest places often having the biggest reduction in intensity, and then others much, much smaller. So yeah, over to you.
Well, I'm glad Sabina answered for us, because I didn't have a real answer. We didn't really went through that too much into that and check the difference with what is generally found. But now we know. Thanks, Sabina.
I said that was easy. The host keeps muting me because I guess I talk a lot. But anyway, let me turn over to the next question, which is from Yalalit Tefera Ihun. One question: what indicator did you actually use for nutrition? Was it wasting? Was it underweight? Stunting? These are mainly for under 5, according to WHO. What indicator did you use when children are 12 years old? The younger children at round 4, for instance. So go ahead, Leo.
Okay. Thank you. That's actually an important question, which yes, we did use the WHO indicators for under 5, which is based on the Head for Age anthropometric measure. I don't have at the top of my head what we did for the mothers in the data. Actually, I think we used the UNDP indicators, but I don't have it at the top of my head what actually what cutoff we used in order to delineate mothers undernourished or not in the data. But I can go back and check, and happy to share that information.
All right, anything added to that, Conchita, before we? Okay, Sabina, I know that you always have questions. There are millions of questions. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a question at this moment.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed the paper, both reading it and then hearing it again today. And so I'm torn, because on the one hand, I'm interested in other questions that we could study similarly with the Young Lives data set. And on the other hand, given the prominence of social protection policies now, in the COVID recovery period. I'm curious about ways that you might be thinking of taking this study forward, but with other data sets. And so I sort of have those two kinds of questions. One is really going forward, given the very real criticisms and concerns you raised about social protection, but also given that most of the international institutions are really focusing on that as a pivotal part of the COVID recovery strategy. What are the kinds of analyses that you're thinking of doing, in a sense, on the back of that work to ascertain its impact on both monetary and multidimensional poverty? And then the second is, as you worked with the Young Lives data sets and were thinking of different ways and different programs that they might intersect with, were there others in addition to NREGA or Juntos or whatever that you thought you might also have a go at with Young Lives data sets, including in Vietnam?
I can answer to the first question, Sabina. We are currently, I think, an easy extension, which is something we should do because we've been using so much this data set, is really to use the online survey that Catherine was mentioning, and adding looking at the effect of COVID on a series of indicators. We didn't really, openly speaking, thought about other data set for developing countries because we're spending a lot of time studying what's happening in European countries. And this is a very, I know, I mean, it's a disaster, whatever, but it's the first time in a long time that income inequality has decreased because of COVID. And we are studying France, Italy, Germany, Spain, and there are also some results on the United States showing that actually this pandemic hit harder richer families than poorer ones. So we are working on that and not exploring for the moment other data set for COVID in developing countries. Leo, probably do you want to say something on the second question?
Yes, the second question, which is quite interesting, and it has also been raised to us by referees, and in their case, from the perspective of making sure that the effect we find is actually from these programs and not a spillover of other potential programs. I think in the data, we have a health extension program in Ethiopia and a healthcare program also in India, and a scholarship program for 18 and above students in Peru, other than the three social protection programs that we evaluated here. And these programs seem to be more universal and affect both participants and non-participants equally. So we were not overly concerned about their effects, but it will be interesting to actually focus entirely on them and try to see if they work in tandem with the major social protection programs or not. So we'll take that on board for future analysis. Thank you.
Great. Well, we have, I believe, a question from Catherine Porter. So go ahead, Catherine.
Thanks, James. Yeah, actually, something came up even before I was thinking about my other question around what's happened to people in the interim. And I think, you know, since these are social protection programs, I think what's also very interesting that's happened in the meantime is a bunch of shocks and adverse events, which COVID is the biggest one that we're all seeing now. And that one's quite difficult because it's happened to many people, but we know they also have been experienced to weather shocks or a parent dying or getting sick or various other things. So again, this is for the future agenda, thinking about what this long-term effect of the program is and how much of it is a protection from potential adversity that could have happened if they were not protected using the program. And the question that I actually had said I would ask was pushing you a little bit more around the differences between these programs. And we know that they're very different contexts, but we know that the data are fairly comparable. Do you feel like in a policy context, having really thought about these programs, can you come down on a side about the usefulness of the workfare type program and households having to work and self-target on the one hand versus the kind of conditions around nutritional or educational investments, just really for you to give a bit more of a policy interpretation to some of the findings?
Well, just based on the effects that we estimated and the results we find, I would probably side on the non-conditional, the unconditional kind of transfers, because we see impact, which is even though not as big, but comparable impact as the conditional cash transfer. So for the very poor and vulnerable people, I would say that the conditionality may not be necessary, but again, this is only from what we find here, and this is not taking into consideration other variables around, such as there might be an effect where some evidence exists about the unintended consequences of social protection, as public works programs on human capital, for example. NREGA has in some places increased child involvement in labor or some intra-household labor allocation. So a careful study will be required to disentangle that unintended consequence. But given this information on the question we investigated, I do not see an effect that's big enough to warrant the conditionality attached.
All right, so one final topic that I wanted to bring forth, and that was there are some things called the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index that seems to be something that might be in order to use to evaluate what's going on now in terms of COVID. But I'm not going to ask that. I decided to look at the rest of the questions in the list that I've ignored up till now. Sorry, Nikolai. I'm sorry, Nikolai. Let me ask his questions. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. One question, did you consider how did you address the issue that children grow older and thereby at some point may no longer qualify for deprivation in school attendance or nutrition? Do you explore whether pure aging may result in children leaving deprivation in school attendance or schooling? Sorry, in case I missed something you already explained. Yes, and that's what he asked. Hey, could you give a quick response to that? And I'll hit a couple of more of the questions.
Yes, good question. He didn't miss it. We actually didn't say it in the presentation. If the children are not of school age anymore, then we will consider them as adult members of the household, and that instead of school attendance, their deprivation in education dimension will be measured by years of schooling instead. And that's how we measure the deprivation scoring.
And then we have a question from Adrian Tadeo Gonzalez Laponi, who said, what may most populated countries, highly populated countries like India, Pakistan, or Philippines, learn from Junto's conditional program? established in a relatively little populated area like Peru. Any comments on that?
Again, my answer will be more of a speculative in this regard, because ideally an evaluation program that compares and contrasts conditional transfers with other transfers should have an experimental design, right? One with conditional arm, another with non-conditional, and the pure control groups, and we can actually disentangle the effect of the conditionality versus the direct income effect. So in terms of whether the Peru program can be replicated in India or Pakistan or Philippines, actually depends on the circumstances in those countries, the facilities like the infrastructure in terms of school and healthcare facilities, are they readily available, and is it are we assuming that households are intentionally keeping, or is there a household economy such that it's optimal from the household's perspective to keep children from going to school or not? So unless there is a hard evidence that backs that up, I don't think there is a need for conditional transfer. So probably a large-scale public works program might work better. But again, these are all speculative answers.
Well, thank you. I have one final question, and that's it. And it includes the one I was about to make. And it's from Beverly Nyamimba, requesting presenters' reflection on the following. From a social inclusion point of view, how can targeting be further strengthened to better include those vulnerable households that these programs should aim to reach? For example, the elderly poor, childless households, or households whose children are outside the range covered by the CCT. Is there opportunity here for context-specific MVIs, the multidimensional vulnerability indices, to more tightly target these and to improve social protection program coverage? Well said. The answer.
An excellent question. Answer I do not have, but I can share the experience we have from this. We learned from these three programs. In India and in Ethiopia and Peru, there has been some community validation of the selection criteria. So most likely these most vulnerable households were targeted by these programs. But the problem in Peru is that there is some conditionality in order to be eligible, because elderly on childless households will be excluded by definition from the program. So in that case, there is more to be done to include these most needy households. But one is to include community validation, which is done in both countries. And the other is to, again, which relates to my earlier response, is that to consider whether conditionality is needed or not in order to make these social transfers. But the last point is very important, and probably a question you and Sabine are more in a position to answer.
Well, on that note, I will let her answer then, unless Conchita wants to jump in. Okay, Sabina? Oh, come on, at least you could talk a smidgen about MVIs.
So multidimensional vulnerability indices are trying to bring into a multidimensional measure some of the vulnerabilities that were more likely to be affected by COVID, for example, informal work or overcrowding or lack of hand washing facilities or the presence of an elderly person in the household. But I think the problem here is that we're using Young Lives data sets. And so what we need to design the problems that those data sets can offer and can shed light on, which are going to be households with children of particular ages, because that's the wealth of those data sets. And so I think that that's, for other questions, you need other data sets. But I think that this is a very, very good example of how you can use an existing data set that was set out for a different purpose, but that overlapped with the social protection program to shed a light a rigorous light on some of the impacts on poverty. So I think that's the triumph of this paper.
So on that note, let's finish up and say thank you all for joining us, and saying goodbye from Washington, DC, from Oxford, and from New York. So panelists, please join us for the post event. See you all later next time.